This wire portrait tutorial will show you how to use a simple material like aluminum or galvanized wire to create a line portrait that shows expression. I'll put my favorite materials in the description box. If you love learning about art, hit that subscribe button to support this public school teacher's side hustle. Today I will be playing around with a couple different styles of wire. So I have an 18 gauge galvanized wire and then a 14 gauge aluminum wire, both of which I bought from Blick Art Materials. Then I will be using images from unsplash.com, which is a great website with free images that mostly don't have a copyright. You can purchase some, you can shout out the photographer, but this is such a great resource for art teachers since we don't always have access to photography. Another great option is to do contour drawing first and use those drawings to make your wire portraits. So either do some contour drawing, take your own photographs, or visit unsplash.com to find some copyright-free portraits of expressions that you're inspired by. If you have never tried contour drawing, click the link above to try out one line or contour drawing. Instead of just drawing, which is a great option I've done many times with students, I'm going to take this photograph of this expressive portrait I found. I love how her head is tilted almost profile view. I love the big open mouth smile. I'm not going to do the hands because I'm just not up for that challenge. And I'm going to take a drawing pen, and as if I was drawing contour style, I'm going to outline with one continuous line the most important elements of this work of art. This is a great modification for artists who have limited drawing skills or experience because you are doing the one continuous line, but you're tracing something. So it depends on what your artistic goals are. If your focus is more on the sculpting, then go ahead and just outline with a pen. You could do this directly over a photograph and skip the whole drawing part, but I did that. You can see the wire over to the left, and I felt like this was more approachable. Again, it all depends on your experiences. It all depends on your goals. But this is a great way to kind of look at the expression, look at the important lines, and get a general idea of what your wire could look like. Wire does have a mind of its own because you're going to use one long piece of wire. Now I have a piece of wire that it's about a yard, so I basically just held out both arms, measured and cut it, and I'm going to start with the outside of her head. Now this galvanized wire is tough to work with. I highly recommend the aluminum wire. It was so much easier and it held its shape really well. You can see I did a practice one, and although the wire was thicker, I found it so much easier to work with. I tell my students it's like wrestling with a barbed wire fence. And I teach in Oklahoma, so my students are like, oh yeah, I can relate to that. Because many students, chicken wire, many students work, on farms after school. It's all about that prairie life. But I do like to use the tape, and you can use pliers to kind of fight the wire to do what you want it to do. Now, the beauty of this is there's so many pathways with this work of art. I could do the outlines first and then go in and do the facial features. I could start with the hair. I'm going to go ahead and try and capture the line from the eyebrow into the nose. And again, I'm going to tape important areas so that the wire holds its shape. Now, eventually I will be taking this off the background. So the tape is just a temporary solution. This is not going to look like photorealism. So if that's your expectation, go ahead and change it, because if you've looked at contour drawing, one continuous line is going to capture the energy and the expression and general shapes and lines of your portrait. It is not a photograph, although we are using a photograph to help guide our lines. So I think I've got some loops in there that give it an eye-like detail, and I'm going to go ahead and see if I can fight the wire some more to capture the shape of the nose. Sometimes I use pliers, sometimes I don't. I didn't at all with my practice one with the thicker aluminum wire, but I'm telling you, this galvanized wire, although I like how thin it is and I love how it holds its shape, it is very challenging to get those small details. trying to capture kind of that basic bend of the nose. And I'm going to go in with this smaller metal wire to add some accents. And I have a choice here. Do I do the eyebrow in the next eye, or do I go down into the mouth? It's all about whatever you want to do. So holding that here, I captured my eyebrow, and then I'm going to curve it around. And I think this is a good end point because I am running out of this wire. And so I'm going to loop that here. So the amount of wire you start with is totally up to you, because if you want to add more, you just loop it around several times as I'm doing here. Doing this with a pair of pliers is very helpful because then you won't cut your fingers, but the wire is always going to be a little bit obstinate. So I'm going to kind of end point on the eye, and then you can use the wire to twist, to cut, and then I will reattach wire somewhere else. You can see how it's so much easier to use those pliers for that twisty turn. And you may notice that the face is kind of shifting around a little bit. That's going to happen. I'm going to take all this off the paper and make sure everything sits the way I want it to sit. This girl will never know this is a photo or a sculpture of her, so I'm not worried about like it being exactly perfect. Okay, so my end point of wire is there in the eye, and I'm going to take the extra on this side and figure out what to do with it. I have an ear section here. Ears are really fun. That's one of the reasons why I picked this photograph, because her head was turned and you could see her ear. And it just makes a really interesting shape. It's very recognizable, and I love the twist on the inside. I'm going to hold this here. And again, you could spend lots more time making it look more perfect to the facial features, but I just like capturing the energy and the basic shapes. It all depends on what you're trying to do. Now I'm going to go across her jaw into her chin, and let's see if I can capture a little bit of her open mouth, which I know is a challenge. If you want to not have as much of a challenge, get a portrait where the mouth is closed so you don't have to worry about teeth or a tongue or anything like that. So I'm going to start with kind of the basic shape, get the general shape of the mouth first, and I'm going to take my wire and loop it here to give it a stopping point, very similar to what I did with the eyes. Speaking of the eyes, don't worry that they're all the way off the portrait and not in the right spot. I'm going to spend lots of time getting that correct. And I'm going to loop that through. Again, experiment with using pliers and using just your hands to give that a closed off section. Now I'm going to cut across the mouth, and so I haven't decided if this is going to be the lips or the teeth yet. I'm going to loop it through again to give it a stopping point so the wire stays put. I'm going to grab my pliers to kind of help me with that obstinate wire. Again, the aluminum wire would just be gliding right through, so much easier to work with. This is not impossible, but with students, I can just hear their complaints now. It is going to be the aluminum wire all the way. I'm glad I played around with both so I would have firsthand experience. And I'm going to use a really thin decorative wire for some of the more small details like hair and things like that. So at this point, I could add more detail to the mouth, or I could travel up and connect the facial features together, which is what I'm choosing to do. So I'm going to loop that wire here with the help of my friends, the pliers, and I'm going to try and loop it around at least once so it gives it a nice stopping point so the face doesn't move around so much. Don't be discouraged if your wire fights with you or the eye moves out of place. Wire, you're the boss of it. And so eventually you're going to get everything right back to where you want it to go. Just have to get those key points twisted first. If you rely on just the tape, when you take the tape off, you're not going to have its form. So I'm going to do a eyebrow shape here that leads into the hair. I love working with hair with a wire sculpture because you can make it look however you want. So you can see I'm taking some artistic liberties here and just making this really fun kind of curvy line to mimic a hairline. I'm not doing every single hair. I just want it to look like there is texture and movement that is different from the facial features. I'm going to twist that on the other side using my pliers to give it a stopping point. And then I have this awkward kind of piece of wire off to the left-hand side that I need to decide what to do with. I may just kind of let it hang there, like her cheekbone just kind of stops. That might be kind of fun to leave a gap. We'll see if that bothers me. I can always twist it to something or clip it with wires. And I think what I'm going to do now, as you can see, I'm going to play around with this with the photograph off to the side and it not attached to it anymore. Since I ran out, I'm going to be attaching some new wire, and you can do this at any location that you think it needs it. So I'm just going to add it where I want to add a little bit more detail, and I'm simply going to take my pliers, or you can do this by hand, and I'm going to twist it like a barbed wire 2 to 3 times around my new starting point. I'm doing it around the head. I don't want to do it on a delicate facial feature because I just felt like it would look too bulky. And I'm attaching the same wire, the same galvanized wire that I used before. Now with this wire, I'm going to use 100% of it, taking some artistic liberties with the shape of her head and the style of her hair. So I'm going to give her some like big hair. I'm going to add some shapes. I'm twisting it in key points. This is not where her part is, but it's where I'm going to add like the hair so it gives it a stopping point so it's not moving around. And I'm basically giving her bigger hair with more movement than is in the photograph because it does crop it at the top of her head. So I did speed things up just a little bit here because I'm getting just the basic outline, but you can see that this gives her a little bit more of a style and attitude. As you can see, you can move around the facial features, you can move around the shapes of the head. Now that everything kind of has a loop and a stopping point, you can play around with it. I'm going to give her this odd little curl over here. I'm not sure if I love it or hate it. I have this spare wire and I said, hey, why not? We'll see what happens. I'll either keep it or I won't, but since I'm out of wire, I'm just going to kind of give her a little curl on the right hand side. Now I'm using this tiny detail wire. I think it's a 21 gauge. The smaller the wire, the larger the gauge. I have to Google that every time I'm buying wire. And this wire is super easy to use. It is very small. I've used it before for like attaching clay ornaments or hanging on the back of pieces of clay to like hang on a wall. You can get it in lots of fun colors too. So if you want to jazz up your work of art, maybe get some gold, or they have purple, just whatever you want. And I'm using this as accents. I want to add a little bit more detail in the face, and I want to add a little bit more detail in the hair. This wire is so easy to work with that I don't think I use my pliers even once. You might ask, well, why don't you just use this for the whole thing? You could. It's just so thin. With the size of my portrait, I felt like it wasn't quite the right length. Kind of like think if in drawing how you have line variety, and I just felt like it was a little too dainty. But I could be wrong. If you like how it looks, go for it. And it is so malleable, it doesn't hold its shape quite as well. But if you're doing smaller scale or you're doing multiples, this would definitely be a fun thing to play around with. And I'm just kind of looping through areas I've already done, thinking what needs a little bit more of an accent or a smaller, finer line that would be really difficult to go back in with the galvanized wire, but would be super easy with this thin accent wire. I'm going to do some repeated lines in her hair to give it just the illusion that there's hair on her head. So you know what it is, and you know, oh, that's not just her head, or that's not inside her face. It just gives you a little bit more detail. And this wire, again, is just so stinking easy to loop through. You won't see me use the pliers. And I'm just giving her almost if her hair is kind of pulled back on that side and the lines are going up and down following her skull. I've worked my wire back to her face and I'm looping it around to give it a stopping point. I'm going to see if I can give her a little bit more detail in her eye. So that spiral that I'm creating, I'm just doing more spiraling. So think of this as like the finer detail inside the eye. And although it is subtle, I do think it kind of elevates that area once I get it inside the eye, of course. And then I can go back in and play around with smaller, finer details like eyelids versus eyebrows and things like that. So it just gives you a little bit more options because it's so much easier to work with. And I'm just going to play around here, not even looking at the photograph, just making it up as I know a face, you know, the details of a face to have. As you see me doing here, always loop it at a stopping point. So if you're done working with one part, like the hair, loop it so you can move on to the eye. Once you're done with one part, like the eye, loop it so you can move on to an area like the nose. And I'm going to create that little bump down at the bottom of the nose because I felt like I didn't capture that very well with the thicker wire. And so I'm just going to give it a little bit of a bump down. I'm going to loop it here so that it doesn't shift around. And then I'll put some more detail work into the right side eye. Once I loop it in place, I'm going to repeat my steps and I'm going to create that little spiral to give the eye more depth and dimension. Now, so it doesn't move around, I'm going to loop it and tie it like an anchor point. So anytime you move from one facial feature to the other, loop it around that base wire at least once with the small wire, 2 or 3 times if it's the larger wire. And then I'm going to kind of twist around the eyebrow to give it more texture so it stands out more than, say, the eyelid. I could do this more, but I'm trying to keep things very simple. But I could do that more to give the eyebrow more of a textured effect. That could be really cool. Since I'm running out of wire, I'm just going to loop it a few times here until I run out of it. And then I'm going to think, how do I take this floating head and attach it to a base? Now, you could just use it as a floating head and attach it to a black, or mount it to a black piece of mat board, and those look really great, almost like a wire drawing. Or you can create a base by elongating your wire face into a neck and shoulders. I'm going to take a new piece of wire and attach it where the lip meets the chin, because that was kind of a floating area because I ran out of wire on that side, which I think looks cool. I might decide I hate it, but you know. And so remember, with wire, I'm going to loop it around 2 or 3 times to give it a really good stationary point and to give it a good base. And you can see the pliers really do help with this, unless you're using the aluminum wire, and then totally up to you. It's your preference on how to work, but you can see me twisting around the wire here. And then I have a new longer piece of wire to create a neck into like a shoulder chest area. And so this I'm making up. I'm not following the photograph. I want to give her a nice long neck that curves down. And then I have this wooden block that I'm going to staple it to. So you don't need a wooden block necessarily. I love how these look though. And generally I have my students paint them black so they look really professional, or you could stain it if it's a nice piece of wood. Another option is you can make a big spiral or circle down at the bottom and let the wire kind of hold itself. That's fun, but I feel like this is more stable and professional looking. So this is generally the route I go with my students. As the neck and shoulders will be holding up my entire sculpture, I'm going to take my pliers and loop it on the other side to give it a stability point, so the wire doesn't move around, so it's really stable in kind of one solid form. I'm looping through like I'm sewing the inside of my face, and I want to loop this a couple times, so again it doesn't move and it's a really good stability point. Right now it's looped, but you can see it moving. So I'm going to take my friend the pliers, I'm going to hold on to that wire, and I'm going to twist it through the other side a couple times. I'm going to test out and see how stable it is. It feels like it's holding its own pretty well. I like how big this is too. And then I'm going to figure out how to attach it to the base. So I'm going to put it across at a diagonal, and then I'm going to use a staple gun to attach my wire to the base. I think you could probably use a stapler, just like a desk stapler, as long as you hit it right in the center a couple times. But I'm going to use the staple gun that I have, and I'm going to go through straddling the wire on both sides. Now, it's not going to hold it yet. So I have this spare wire, and I'll show you what to do with it. You can hit your staples in with a hammer or a pin cap if you're like me, and then take your extra wire, and you need to create a loop or a square or a shape to counterbalance the straight line across. So as I'm fighting with my wire here, I'm going to take the extra and I'm going to loop it around, kind of going across the base, giving it a circular effect because the neck is pretty circular, so it gives it dimension and stability. I know that this is crazy. The wire is bouncing around everywhere. And don't worry, I'm going to make it look pretty. I know right now it kind of looks like a hot mess. Think of this end point and where you attach your wire is important. You don't want it to look messy, or if you're making it messy, make it look like you did it on purpose. I am doing one loop here to give it a stability point, and then I'm just going to wrap it around until I run out of wire and just loop it underneath itself. Once it's a stable form, I can go back in and I can make the wire look purposeful and not just like I just wrapped it around randomly, although a random line is really fun with wire. Now that it's attached and I'm done with it, I'm just going to kind of look at it from this angle, and then if I want to make any adjustments to the placement of the facial features or the general shapes and forms, I can do that. Okay, here's my wire in front of a white background. I'm going to kind of rotate it so that you can see what it looks like from different angles, which is really fun. Remember, this is a sculpture, so looking at it from different viewpoints is one of the benefits of working in this style. Another really fun thing to do is to get a flashlight, turn off the lights, and play around with the shadows. These make amazing shadows and they photograph so well. Thank you so much for sticking around and making art with me. And if you're interested in more sculpture tutorials, check these out. If you want to see what my students are up to in my classroom, find my Instagram at thatartteacher_Machado, and my website, thatartteacher.com, has full-length lesson plans, student examples, and rubrics, all for free.